Okay, so we're continuing our talk about Christianity. So I played you a little video from Jesus Christ Superstar, which talks about, or shows, I should say, part of his trial, supposedly part of his trial, where he went before this local Jewish ruler called Herod. That's who the guy's supposed to be portraying. And Herod was kind of disappointed because he had heard of Jesus and wanted Jesus to work some tricks for him and stuff like that. He was curious, and Jesus wouldn't do anything, so he was disappointed, and he sends him back to... Where did he send him back to? Where did I end? Yes. On the PowerPoint. To this dude. Pontius Pilate to be tried. Okay, and that's where I ended. And perhaps this is an appropriate time to talk about these things because next week is what? What is next week for Christians? Palm Sunday, Easter eventually. In general, does anyone know what the week is called? Huh? Huh? Speak up, please. It's making me work. What did you say for now? Lent. Well, no, actually, this is Lent now, but next week is not Lent. Well, I shouldn't say that because Lent ends on Holy Thursday.
Is it Good Sunday? Is it Good Sunday?
Good Sunday?
Friday.
Good, yes.
Friday.
Good Friday, yes. But there are actually 3 days. Friday, Good Sunday. Actually, Good Holy Thursday, Great and Holy Friday, Great and Holy Saturday. Yes. What is the whole week called, though? Does anyone know? Does anyone know? Holy Week.
She said it like 13 times.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Miss Paul. It's quiet back there. I said to speak up. Okay, so good. Thank you, Miss Paul. Thank you, Miss Dietrich. Holy Week. Yes, it begins with Palm Sunday on Sunday. It's the holiest time of the year for Christians, culminating, of course, in Easter Sunday, the celebration of the rising from the dead of Jesus, which I haven't talked about yet, but I will. And what else is going on religiously? Not just for Christians, we have another religious group celebrating
Passover?
That's not. Thank you, sir. I actually wasn't thinking of that, but I should have been. Yes, Passover for the Jews. They're celebrating their liberation from slavery in Egypt many thousands of years ago. Good. So the Judaism is celebrating something major. What other religious group has just started? Yes, Mr. Watkins. Ramadan. For which religion? Islam. Islam, which the whole month is a celebration of God's revelation of the Quran, their written scripture to the Prophet Muhammad. So they take a whole month of fasting and prayer and good works to honor that event, which we'll talk about when we talk about Islam. Okay, so a number of things are going on religiously in the world. Let's get back to Christianity. I've ended with talking about how Jesus was arrested by the religious leadership and was brought to the secular leadership. The Romans were in control of Palestine at the time, and their local governor was a man named Pontius Pilate, who we don't know very much about. Outside of the story of Jesus and his relationship to Jesus, Pontius Pilate is not very well known. I mean, he's known because of Jesus and his role in the execution of Jesus. So we know next to nothing about him. We do know that he was the local ruler of the province of Judea from 26 to 36. I put that on the PowerPoint slide. And I think, did I talk about the Pontius Pilate inscription last time? Do you have it in your notes? Anybody? Anybody? Yes, Mr. Holstein? Ruler? Is that what you said? Okay. Perhaps. But you don't have anything in your notes specifically about that picture of the stone there? It does, yes. Yes, it does. Anybody? Okay, maybe I didn't talk about it. But I'll just briefly talk about it because it's interesting. I forget when it was discovered. Did I put that in the PowerPoint? I think it was 1961. But anyway, it was discovered in Israel in the last century, and it's our first actual archaeological evidence for the existence of this guy. I mean, we knew about him before. He's mentioned in the religious writings of Christianity, but he's also mentioned by an early Jewish historian from the 1st century AD. So we had some literary evidence of his existence, and there was no reason for them to make him up. But here's our first literally hard evidence, this stone, which was, I guess, a foundation stone for a building that he built in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. You can see the name up here, Tiberium, Emperor Tiberius, who was the emperor at the time of Jesus. Tiberius. And you can see his name. See Pontius Pilatus here. So you can see his name. So this building dedicated to Tiberius was installed or erected by Pontius Pilate, who was the prefect, which is just a local ruler of Judea. So that's our first archaeological evidence that he actually exists, the Pontius Pilate inscription. Yeah, 1961, I have it in my notes, discovered in northern Israel. Okay, so Jesus is brought before this guy for trial, and in Christian accounts, the Jewish leadership is mostly blamed for Jesus' trial and execution, but they also preserve the memory that Pilate was, in fact, concerned about Jesus' supposed claim to be the Messiah, this king figure, okay, that the Jews were expecting. We talked about the Messiah when we talked about Judaism. So Pilate didn't care about any religious claims Jesus might have been bandying about. He was concerned about the political claims that Jesus might be this Messiah figure, this king savior who was going to overthrow the enemies of the Jews, which would include him and the Roman government. And so that would be treasonous. And so whatever happened during the trial, I wasn't there, and a lot of people weren't there, and we don't have records of it. But the ultimate result was that Jesus was executed by crucifixion. And this act, did I put that on the other side? Yeah, crucifixion, which I give you a definition here just to describe it. Basically, you have a pole in the ground, and then you nail someone or tie someone to a beam of wood. You hoist them up on this pole and hang them from it, so it makes a cross, okay? So crux fatio, to make a cross, okay? So there's a stake in the ground on which someone is suspended. And as I said, you can tie a person to the cross. You can nail them to the cross if you want them to suffer more, stuff like that. The result, or the suffering from crucifixion, or the result of death from crucifixion, is not really from the nailing on the cross. A lot of images of Jesus, some of them can be quite bloody, of the crucifixion, where Jesus is all whipped and dripping with blood. If anyone saw the movie The Passion of the Christ, maybe your Sunday school or your confirmation class or your youth group went to see the movie, by Mel Gibson's movie of Jesus, his last days, and Jesus in that movie is like shredded, but really the fatality of crucifixion was not from being nailed to the cross or whatever. It's from asphyxiation or suffocation, that the person is suspended on the cross, and eventually the muscles of the arms and the legs and also the abdomen become so exhausted that they can't support the weight of the body anymore. The person will slump down, and the diaphragm can't move anymore or inflate the lungs anymore, and so the person will die by suffocation. And this is a long process. It can take days, for this to happen. So it's a lot of suffering, and it's meant to be a lot of suffering. It was an awful way to die. Of course, if the Romans wanted to increase the suffering, then yes, they could nail the person, and they could also whip them beforehand. They could do other things and stuff like that. And the fact that Jesus apparently was nailed to the cross, he wasn't just hung on a cross with ropes, tells you, and that he was whipped before, tells you something about the seriousness with which the Romans took the claim that he might be this king figure. And in fact, the charge on the cross, when the Romans crucified, since it was a legal proceeding, it was a punishment, at the top or over the head of the person crucified, they would put a title, what's called a titulus, or a title, that would proclaim the charge. So, this is Marcus, a thief, or something like that, which would announce the charge and would also tell people, basically, like, if you steal people's stuff, we will kill you. If you break the law, this is what's going to happen to you. And so the charge over Jesus's, and all the Christian writings agree on this, that the title that Pilate put was, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." So it tells you right there, not that this is Jesus, Son of God, or this is Jesus who claimed to forgive sins, all the things that maybe the Jews were concerned of, the Jewish leadership, not the religious stuff, it was the political thing. Jesus was claiming to be the King of the Jews. So crucifixion was, as I described, an horrific practice, and it was only reserved for outlaws and the lowest of the low. And even according to Roman law, Roman citizens could never be crucified. You would be decapitated, have your head cut off, which was seen as more merciful and dignified than crucifixion. So it was, and Jesus, of course, was not a Roman citizen, so this is what was going to happen to him. This is an interesting picture. I'll give you the definition of crucifixion here. This is an interesting picture, which is called the Alexamenos graffito. A graffito is, an etching or drawing on a wall of a building. And if you have more than one etching, it's called graffiti. But if you just have one etching, it's a graffito. It comes from Italian, so there you go. But Alexamenos graffito, which dates to around 200 A.D., and this apparently is our earliest depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus. And yet we know from the drawing, or the graffito, that it probably was not drawn or etched into the stone wall by a Christian. Why? Why, Miss Fleming? What indicates to you that this might not have been drawn by a Christian? Is there a giveaway? Is there a telltale sign?
It don't look like something like a Christian one, right?
Why? Why do you think that?
It doesn't really look very religious.
Okay, it doesn't look religious. That's fine. And you're right. I mean, crucifixion was not a religious event. It was, a legal thing, political.
What exactly is it supposed to be?
Well, we think it's a picture of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, or the earliest one that we have, but it's probably not by a Christian. I'm wondering for your thoughts, if anyone has any thoughts about why we might think that. Is there anything curious about the depiction that maybe a Christian would not do? Yes, it's big.
Is it the head of the piece on the cross or no?
What about the head?
I don't think it's human.
Yeah, the head doesn't look human. This may be easier. Is that easier to see? Is that easier to see? Don't answer. What did you say, Miss Fleming?
I said it looks like a horse.
Looks kind of like a horse. I mean, art is always in the eye of the beholder, but yeah, it looks like a horse. It doesn't look like a cat to me, or a fox. It looks like, maybe a horse animal, donkey maybe. I don't think it's a dog. It doesn't seem to be close to a dog's head. It looks more like, like a mule, well, not a mule, but a donkey or a horse, yeah? But some kind of animal. It's clearly not human, yes? It's clearly some kind of animal, not a non-human animal. Yes? No? So why might that be unusual? Why wouldn't a Christian probably have drawn Jesus like that, Jesus on the cross? What do you think? Would a Christian draw Jesus on the cross with a donkey's head? Do you think? Why not?
Since another person is drawn in the picture and depicted having a human head, anything very clearly, but it kind of seems like they're depicting him as like less than human as he's hung up there on the cross.
Interesting. So disrespectful, you might say. That's interesting. I'm glad you pointed out that, yes, there's another figure here which seems to be a human being, raising his hand, pointing to the figure on the cross. Okay? We actually, maybe you've also noticed there are words here, which I'll get into in a second. Okay? So, yeah, it seems now, once we get into the words will help us and give us a clearer picture, because these are Greek words that are etched here. And if you translate it, this is the guy's name. Alexamenos is a man's name. Maybe you can make that out. But it says Alexamenos sebete theon, which could mean Alexamenos worship God like a command, or worships his God. So Alexamenos, I'll go with the other one. Alexamenos worships God. Okay? Which leads me to think that it's probably Christian. I mean, there are other people who proposed other theories and try to say, well, no, it really doesn't show it, but, it doesn't show the crucifixion of Jesus. It could be something else. The problem with that is, I don't know of any other crucified God from the ancient world, Yet there are stories of gods dying in ancient myths, but none through crucifixion. So Jesus, that seems to be unique to the story of Jesus, that he's the Son of God, or God himself, and that he is crucified. Okay, so this man, Alexamenos, is worshiping his God. So it's probably Christian, and it's probably, disrespecting the Christian religion. This is probably a picture of Alexamenos. So someone is probably making fun of this man who is a Christian who worships a crucified God. Because, of course, crucifixion was for criminals, and it was disgusting. As I said, it was a horrific way to die. It was a shameful way to die. It was not something that was that you would necessarily want to display for everyone to see. It was something you want to keep secret and not talk about. And so the fact that you would worship this person, and even say he's a god, this guy who died as a criminal, would be something that might have sounded ridiculous to the average Roman pagan. Okay? But it does show us the crucifixion. It gives us an idea of how probably typically the Romans crucified. So just I thought that was interesting. I would share that with you. It also gives us an idea of what early Christians were already thinking about Jesus, that Jesus, already by the 3rd century AD, had been in some way divinized. He was more than just a man to them. Okay, so someone wants to make fun of that fact. Yeah, they stick a donkey's head or a horse's head on their crucified God. Oh, and I should also add that was one of the rumors about Christians, also Jews as well, that the pagans thought that Christians worshipped a donkey's head in their meetings. Whatever they did in those buildings, their churches, they apparently worshipped a donkey's head. So that's another thing that leads me to think that it's probably an anti-Christian graffito. So Jesus was crucified. However, the story doesn't end there. If it did, we wouldn't be talking about it. We wouldn't be talking about it as a world religion. We have what's called the resurrection. A few days later, after Jesus died by crucifixion, some of his followers claimed that the tomb where he had been buried was empty. But more than just being empty, because there could be a lot of explanations for why the tomb is empty, but more than that being empty, they claimed that Jesus had actually appeared to them alive again. And this event is called the resurrection, from the Latin word resurgo, which simply means to raise up or to arise. So literally the rising up. So the resurrection is the Christian belief. Yeah, I got you. Hold on. That after his death and burial, Jesus was raised physically from the dead. Yes, Ms. Fleming.
I was going to say, because I was at school of my life, and something that kind of stuff was like, he went to up to God, and he was kind of in heaven, and he was more so, he did, he was more so in spirit, but people on earth always his followers and stuff, so he kind of did what he did, but in the more spiritual.
For the resurrection?
Yes.
This is what you believed or you were taught?
I was kind of taught,
Yeah, I think some modern Christian groups, some modern denominations might interpret it more as a spiritual event, that by saying Jesus was raised up to God, like he was raised up into heaven with God, he was glorified with God.
Yes.
But that's not, traditionally Christianity has seen it also as a physical event. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Yeah, no, traditionally it's seen as a physical event, that it was more than just, Jesus was certainly glorified and raised, from the Christian view, that he was certainly raised up and glorified by God, but also the fact that the body wasn't there. Okay, it's not like they were saying, yeah, the body's there, the corpse is still there, but hallelujah, Jesus has been raised, he's with God now, even though the message was that we can't find it. He's not there anymore. And then he starts physically appearing to people. And they think he's a ghost, but he has to prove himself. He shows them the wounds of the crucifixion. He lets people touch him and says, no, it's still me. I'm different, but, maybe a little bit in pain. Still recovering. But, can't walk as well as I used to. But, sorry, Jesus, I shouldn't joke about that with Palm Sunday coming. I'll have to I'll go to our church's penance service before I leave. But, yeah, it's still me. So anyway, so that's the belief. Okay, so we have the resurrection. Who was Jesus? What was Jesus? Well, just looking at his life, Jesus was clearly a teacher, because he teaches stuff. He has beliefs about the world, and he teaches them to followers. He was a wonder worker. Whether you believe in miracles or not, that's okay, that's your belief. But, just looking historically, he was known as a wonder worker. People believed he could work miracles. Was he the Messiah? Well, that's an interesting question that scholars debate and talk about, because Jesus never came out openly and claimed to be the Messiah. Why? We don't know. I mean, if he doesn't commonly refer to himself as the Messiah, then he's not going to give an explanation for that fact. He just doesn't do it. So we don't really know why. On the other hand, he never says that he's not the Messiah. When the question does come up in the Christian writings, or people seem to ask him questions about it, he doesn't say he's not. But he also doesn't really come out and say what he is. But he does seem to hint at it quite a bit. And there might be reasons for that. As I taught you with Judaism, there were a lot of different ideas about what the Messiah might have been in early Judaism. Political Messiah, spiritual Messiah. So some people theorize that Jesus was really none of those. He didn't think of himself in those terms, so he avoided those terms. Also, if he went around saying he was the Messiah, there's no easier way to get himself killed, I guess, more quickly than to do that. So he was hesitant to maybe do it. Maybe it was a political move. But he does seem to hint at it quite a bit, because his most common designation or title that he gives himself, he doesn't go around saying, hey, I'm Jesus the Christ, I'm Jesus the Christ, I'm Jesus the Christ. His most common way of talking about himself is calling himself the Son of Man. That's his most frequent self-description. He refers to himself in the third person as the Son of Man. And this title, by the time of Jesus, had arisen, first appears in a Jewish writing, the book of Daniel, which is part of the Tanakh. It's part of the writings, I believe, the Ketuvim. Daniel's part of the writings. And in chapter 7, Daniel has a vision in this book. It's a book of visions. This man sees visions. And he has a vision of a person like a son of man, who will come on the clouds, come from God, and will defeat the enemies of Israel. And by the time of Jesus' life, a lot of Jews interpreted that as a prediction of the Messiah. So the fact that Jesus was using this title specifically of himself could have been viewed as Jesus kind of winking and nodding and saying, you know what I am the Messiah, I'm the fulfillment of this prophecy from Daniel 7. Anyways, so no one apparently thought of a suffering Messiah. That was outside of the Jewish wheelhouse. No one was apparently believing the Messiah would suffer. In fact, when we read from the Mishnah Torah of Maimonides, hopefully you read it, that was one of the problems that Jews had with Jesus, was that, you knew he wasn't the Messiah because he was killed. The Messiah was not supposed to be able to be killed. Okay? So later Christian tradition sees the resurrection as God's confirmation that Jesus was indeed the Jewish Messiah. So that's how he becomes Jesus the Christ. Okay? Later Jewish tradition says, yes, he was in fact the fulfillment of this prophecy, but it was not like anything the Jews thought would be coming. It's not what they were expecting of a Messiah. Okay. Now the time after Jesus, the early church, which we'll talk about the early church period from circa the 30s, just after Jesus, to the 400s AD. Scholars, religious studies scholars, call the group that developed around Jesus the Jesus movement. Okay, that's a common way that scholars will talk about it. The early movement. They don't call it Christianity, they call it the Jesus movement, because it wasn't as organized as it would later become, so they want to reflect that in their terminology. So the Jesus movement, and the Jesus movement does not end with Jesus' death, obviously, because there are claims that Jesus came back to life, okay? And then he ascended, he went up into heaven eventually, so he's no longer with us. But anyways, after Jesus' death, his followers reorganize around the 12 apostles who continue his mission. And you should note that, the Jesus movement was still a Jewish reality. It came out, Jesus was a Jew, the early apostles were Jews, and so the first Christians were, for the most part, still Jews and still practiced Judaism, but with one major difference. They believed that Jesus of Nazareth was really the Messiah. But then enter this man, Paul of Tarsus, who died around 65 AD. He's called Paul of Tarsus. That's how he refers to himself. He's also called Saul, which was his Jewish name. And, it wasn't uncommon in the ancient world for people to have multiple names, especially, for Jews. You would have your Jewish name, but then you would have your kind of Gentile name, your common name, for pagan society. So he was Shaul, Saul was his Jewish name, but he was also called Paulos or Paul, which sounded similar. People do this in other cultures as well. A girlfriend and friends who were Korean, and a lot of times they would have their Korean name, but they would have a similar name in English. So I had a girlfriend, her name was Boyun, but she called herself Brianna. Okay. I had a friend, now a priest, Korean. His name was Jong-soo, but he went by Diego. Okay, so people do this even to this day in certain cultures, and this was no different in the ancient world. You had your Jewish name, but you had a Gentile name as well that you would go by. And Paul most often calls himself Paul. And he was from the town of Tarsus, or city of Tarsus, which is in southern Turkey. Darn it, I hate this. I can't barely see it. Why? There we go. Look at our map here. And I'll shoot over here to Turkey, the country of Turkey. And here, if you see where I am, southern Turkey is where the ancient city of Tarsus was, where Paul was from. So he was from Greek culture, spoke Greek. He might have been a rabbi. At first, he violently opposed the Jesus movement. He was not in favor of it and attacked it. But later on, according to the story, he had a vision of Jesus, and which converted him to the Christian cause. So he did a complete 180 and became a Christian. And Paul of Tarsus is the one who could be credited with moving the Jesus movement to from being a unique small movement within Judaism to Christianity, the world religion. So it could be, some scholars will identify Paul as the one who moves the Jesus movement from just this little Jewish movement that believed Jesus was the Christ to now a new religion called Christianity. How does this happen? Well, it happens because Paul, along with other early Christians, tried to convert or change the minds of fellow Jews, arguing that Jesus is the Messiah. He actually was fulfillment of God's promises of a Messiah to Israel, But this move or this attempt largely fails amongst the Jewish population. So what they did, Paul especially, was they turned to Gentiles who followed Judaism. Okay, this was an interesting movement within the ancient world. You had non-Jews who were kind of like dissatisfied with the pagan religions, the stories of the gods and the myths and stuff like that. But they found something in Judaism and its belief in one God only, and its kind of moral code of how to live a life and all the rules to follow that gave you purpose in life. They found something in that, and yet they would actually follow and believe in Judaism, but they would remain Gentiles. So they wouldn't go the whole way. Men wouldn't be circumcised. They might not eat kosher, but they would attend synagogue and participate in the prayers as much as they could. So they might have considered themselves in a way spiritual Jews. They were called God-fearers, or people at the door, because they would stand at the door of the synagogue. They were not allowed to enter the full community. But they're called God-fearers. And so Paul starts turning his attentions to them and preaching to them about Jesus. Gentile on here? Yes, I did. Gentile. There's your definition of a Gentile. It comes from the Latin word gens, which means a nation or a group of people. So the people of the nations, the Gentiles, are how Jews referred to those outside of the people of Israel. So non-Jews. So Paul starts preaching to these Gentile sympathizers of Judaism. And what he starts saying is that, accepting and keeping the law of Moses and all the rules of the Jewish religion, especially things like circumcision, were not really necessary as a prerequisite for believing in Jesus or joining the Christian community or joining the Jesus movement. So this is really a revolutionary idea. In other words, he's basically saying you don't have to become a Jew to believe in Jesus the Jew. Now, that was news to the Jewish believers in Jesus, and so you actually do have controversy over this in early Christianity. There are Jewish Christians who are like, Paul's wrong. So obviously, Jesus was Jewish. Jesus was circumcised. So if we follow the example of Jesus and his teachings, we should become Jews, basically, before you can believe in Jesus. But so there's controversy. And the idea is, or the movement, or the matter, I should say, is not really eventually settled until something called the Council of Jerusalem, which it may be legendary. We don't know if it is actually held, but it's described in early Christian writings. If you're interested, you can see the book Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. You should have written that out. Acts of the Apostles in the Christian writings in their New Testament, where it describes this meeting of the early leaders, the 12 apostles of Jesus, where they have to decide this question. They meet in Jerusalem. It's a council. It's a meeting. Maybe it occurred around 50 AD. We're supposing it actually happened. And they basically kind of agree with Paul that no, non-Jews do not have to become Jewish in order to believe in Jesus. They can believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And with this decision, you can kind of identify the origin of Christianity as a religion. This kind of starts transforming Christianity into something more than just a movement within Judaism. Why? Because the result will be that basically the eventual loss of the Jewish population. There will be, whereas it's a Jewish movement within Judaism, you're going to start having this influx of more and more non-Jews believing in Jesus, these Gentiles. And so the Jesus movement, surprisingly enough or ironically enough, becomes no longer a Jewish religious movement. It becomes a separate religion dominated by non-Jews, i.e., in other words, Christianity. So we have this movement from Messianic Jews to just followers of the Christ, from the synagogue to the church, which is what this community calls itself. Jews also called themselves this. They used the same Greek word which I'm not going to get into, but I'm not going to talk about the Greek word behind it. But anyways, Jews use a similar Greek word to translate what they called themselves, the assembly of Israel. Okay, this group of Israel, and Christians use that same Greek word to define themselves. Well, maybe I will tell it to you since I'm talking about it. It's just a ecclesia, long E, ecclesia. There's the L in there. Sorry, ecclesia. So Greek-speaking Jews would refer to the Ecclesia Israel, the Church of Israel. You might translate it, but so it was still a Jewish term. So they called themselves the Assembly of the Lord. Okay, the word ecclesia means an assembly, those who are called out or called together. That's all the word means. So the word church literally means an assembly or coming together. Don't worry about Kuriakos. I'm not going to get into that. Don't worry about that. Anyways, want to talk about that? Yeah. Like Judaism, Christianity was a minority religion within the larger Roman Empire. This is the territory of the Roman Empire at the time, around the time. And Judaism was a very small religion within that. And, obviously the Christianity or the Jesus movement was even smaller within Judaism. So it was a small minority religion in the Roman Empire. But at least Judaism was old. It was thousands of years old, whereas Christianity was new. And so a lot of people in the Roman Empire, as soon as they encountered Christianity, when it became more and more prevalent over the decades and then the centuries, they saw it as kind of a weird and subversive little group. It was secretive. It worshipped a Jewish criminal, and those were two knocks against Jesus for the non-Jews, the pagans in the Roman Empire. First of all, he's a Jew, and the Jews were kind of looked down upon. There were this weird. Jews were also seen as weird because they wouldn't worship the Roman gods; they would only worship their one God. So a lot of people didn't necessarily like the Jews in the Roman Empire as well. So they worshipped a Jew who was a criminal. He was crucified by the Romans, which was outrageous. It made no sense to people. It sounded ludicrous, laughable. And this Jewish person that they were saying was this holy man, was even disowned by his own people. Most Jews didn't think Jesus was the Messiah and didn't follow him. So that was a knock against Christianity. And yet these Christians were claiming that salvation only came through this man, Jesus. And Christianity was also known for mainly being composed of lower class citizens and stuff like that. So there wasn't a very positive view amongst Christianity, or positive view amongst the pagan society of the Christian religion when they kind of got wind of it or got some knowledge of it. And so Christianity was actively persecuted in the first few centuries of its existence, more for political reasons than religious reasons. It wasn't so much religious intolerance as that, just there was no separation of church and state. Religion and politics and everything, they were all bound together. People didn't think in our categories of a separation. And so to not worship the gods of Rome or the gods of the state was almost like an attack on the state itself and on the government, that you didn't want the government to do well or have the blessings of the gods. It was like treason. Or being, disloyal, stuff like that. And so if the Christians wouldn't worship the gods of Rome, they must be disloyal. They must be traitors. But Christianity over the centuries slowly gained ground until this guy happened, who's the next kind of major figure in Christian history after Paul of Tarsus. Constantine, sometimes called the Great, but Constantine the First, who lived from 272, maybe he was born then, until 337 AD. When was he born? We don't know for sure. He was not a Christian. He was a pagan. He was a follower of the common pagan religions, polytheistic religions of the Roman Empire at the time. He was a general of a Roman army unit that was stationed, up in France and southern United Kingdom. We call it the United Kingdom today, but call it Britain or England, if you want to call it England. So that's where his unit was. And he later became the emperor of the Roman Empire. Now, I have to make a long story short here, obviously, but basically, I'm concerned about his connection to Christianity and why he's so important. The empire. Actually, do I want to mention that? I do have to go a little bit into Roman history. Okay, so I have to do that. Let me take a drink of coffee before I launch into this. Because I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I do feel like I have to explain this little bit so the other stuff makes sense. The Roman Empire. I forget which year it was. I wrote it down somewhere. But anyways, one of the emperors named Diocletian divided the Roman Empire in half. Don't know if I wrote down the date here. I know it's on my computer, but hold on one second. Actually, no, you give an extra credit point. If someone wants to look on their phone and find out when Diocletian divided the empire, I want to say 290, but I could be wrong about that. But if you want to look and just find that out, he divided the empire in half. The empire was too big. It was too big to control. Also, every time... Yes?
And it says 293.
293. Thank you, Mr. Holstein. Okay. Also, you had the fact that whenever an emperor died, or was made to die, you know what I'm saying, Mr. Clyde? I'm sure you watched Game of Thrones, you know what I'm talking about. There was a lot of times there was a bloodbath, to get a new emperor, okay? So Diocletian wanted to end that. He wanted to make a very clear line of succession. So the empire was too big, so he cut it in half with an eastern and a western side. And then on each side he put, the emperor, the main ruler, and then like his vice president in a way, his vice ruler who would have the right of succession after the emperor died, or as I said, Mr. Clyde was made to die. Anyways, so the main ruler. Okay, well I don't need to give you the terms. I'll cut that out. That's too much inside. But so you had the main ruler, and then you had like his vice ruler who would succeed him. So, and each side, so you had now two capitals. Rome, the traditional capital. There was a city over here called Byzantium, Constantinople, which is what it will be later called, Byzantium, which was the capital of the Eastern ruler. Okay, so you had a Western ruler over in Rome, you had an Eastern ruler over in Byzantium, and then you had their vice rulers, like their vice presidents underneath them, who had the right of succession once they died, okay? So it would be orderly, you wouldn't keep having these bloodbaths of people killing each other trying to become the next emperor. So that's how it was supposed to work. Didn't work that way. Anyways, at least it didn't work that way for very long. Because people could still kill people. So what happens with Constantine is that his father is the ruler of the West, and his father dies, and the army that Constantine is leading, and he's in Britain at the time, decides to declare him the new ruler of the West, the emperor, you could say, of the western part of the empire. Okay, and this happens, well, it doesn't matter when it happens, but that's what happens. He thinks that he now should rightfully be the leader of the Western Empire. Problem is, there's another dude who thinks that he should be. You see, this didn't work for very long, this whole system. It was a good idea, but it just didn't work. Because you have this other guy who says, no, I'm the leader of the Western Empire. So you're going to have a fight between Constantine and this guy. The guy's name, in case you're wondering, was Maxentius. So there's going to be a fight between Constantine and Maxentius. So basically, that's what happens. Constantine and his army march down from Britain through France, through northern Italy, down to Rome, okay, where they're going to meet up with Maxentius and have a fight. And decide who's going to take over control. And this fight happens in, I didn't put that on the PowerPoint? Poop. Oh well. This fight happens in 312 AD, year 312, at a place called the Milvian Bridge, which apparently is still there in Rome if you want to go see it after all these centuries. And what happens is this guy Maxentius, for whatever reason, decides to cross over this bridge, over the river of this bridge, and to fight Constantine. Oh, what's the problem? Well, the problem is once you cross over the bridge with all your army and your soldiers, you got the river behind you, right? You got nowhere to flee if something goes bad, which it does. Constantine starts to win and to beat Maxentius, and he's got nowhere to flee or retreat to. So his soldiers on horse try to just go through the river, and they drown. And Maxentius apparently tries to swim over the river. He drowns. So it's a complete disaster for Maxentius. I don't know why he did that, or why he didn't think that through, that he would be boxed in with the river behind him. But that's what he did. So he lost to Constantine. Now, that's not the main part of the story. The fact Constantine wins, that's good for Constantine. But for Christianity, what does that have to do with Christianity? What it has to do with Christianity is the night before the battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, Constantine has a dream. Or maybe he has a vision. There are different versions of the story. But anyways, he's looking up at the sky, and he sees something in the sky. He sees something in the sky. And scholars to this day debate, what did he see? Was it a supernova exploding, a comet, the sun doing things? I don't know. But if it was at night, then it probably wasn't the sun. But apparently he sees the Christian symbol in the sky. He sees an image of the Chi Rho, as it's been interpreted in later times. The first two letters of Christ in Greek his name is spelled like this: Christos, Christ. Okay? And in early Christianity, they symbolized this by taking the first two letters, the Chi, the K, and the Rho, the R sound, and the Rho like that, and the Chi like that. It's called the Chi Rho symbol. Sometimes in stories you'll hear that he saw an actual cross in the sky, but this seems to be what he thought he saw. He saw the Christian symbol in the sky shining, and apparently a voice said, or he saw words in Greek that said, "By this sign you will conquer." Okay, so he took it as he's a pagan. No, he's not a Christian. He's a pagan, but he took it as an omen that he would win the battle, and of course he does. And so for him, this changes Constantine's life. He gives credit, or he credits his victory in becoming the actual ruler of the Western Empire to the Christian God. So he's very grateful to the Christian God. And he starts putting, one of the things he does before the battle is he puts this symbol of the Chi Rho all over his soldiers, on their garments, on their standards that they would carry into battle. Okay, they would have these poles with standards and symbols on top of them, usually of pagan gods. He takes them off and puts the symbol of the Chi Rho on them, the Christian symbol, and he wins the battle. So he's very grateful. So when he becomes ruler of the West, in conjunction with the ruler of the East, who is another dude that I'm not going to get into, don't worry about him, but they both agreed to issue this the very next year, 313, the Edict of Milan. Edict of Milan. Milan's a city in northern Italy, from which this edict, declaration is another way you could translate it. This declaration of Milan, this Edict of Milan, in appreciation to the victory that he received from the Christian God, Constantine gives tolerated status to all non-pagan religions. He doesn't really specifically name Christianity, but that's what he's doing. Any religion that are not the pagan religions of Rome, they are now tolerated, which means they will not be persecuted. They can own property. They have legal rights within the the empire. caution here, though, because sometimes you will hear people say that that Constantine that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire. He did not. The Edict of Milan does not do this. It just legalizes it. It gives it tolerated status, so now it can exist. Now, did Constantine become a Christian? He was certainly grateful to the Christian God, but there was a question of whether he was a true believer or just a savvy politician. And I don't have any evidence to see that Constantine was insincere, but this was a kind of a sea change for in the history of Christianity, because Constantine starts to favor the church. For example, he makes Sunday a public holiday. He builds churches. He does things like accepting church leaders from taxes. It's always very nice, just through the nexus of religion and money. So they don't have bishops and priests don't have to pay taxes, etc., and so forth. I'm not going to worry about Byzantium. I think I'll move. Actually, I think I do have to talk about that because we'll get to the Pope. Yeah. Okay. So he does things to favor the Christian church. In 330 AD, to make a long story short, eventually Constantine kills off the Eastern emperor, and so now the whole system is gone, and you have just one sole emperor of the Roman Empire again, which is Constantine. And he makes a decision that will affect Christianity even to this day by deciding to move the capital from Rome, the main capital. So he decides to simply move from Rome in the west, and now the one emperor of the empire will live in Byzantium, which you can see here he renames after himself Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. But he renames the city. There was a city there already, Byzantium, where the ruler of the East lived. So he just kind of rebuilds the city, builds it up, and renames it after himself. Now, why does this affect Christianity? Well, because it caused two things to develop. First of all, it kind of embedded in the idea of some Christians, especially in Eastern Christianity, that the Christian emperor was the supreme leader of both church and state. So they kind of lifted up the emperor to the status of the head of the church in a way. And that continues to this day. Because you have one of your readings for Christianity is on the Pan-Orthodox Council that was a few years ago, I think 2016, of the Eastern Orthodox churches, these Eastern Christians. And it took them, I think, hundreds of years almost, but certainly a long, long time of negotiating. One of the main problems was there was no emperor, there's no Eastern emperor anymore. So there was no one to convoke the council. So how do they convoke this council as a meeting of Eastern bishops? They finally kind of finagled it and were able to kind of come up with a solution. The council still didn't kind of go as planned, but nevertheless. So it embedded this idea of the complete union of church and state. The emperor was a Christian emperor, and he was kind of like the guide of the church. It also, by him moving the government to the east, created a power vacuum in the west. And what this did was develop the papacy, because you had no emperor or ruler in the west to kind of take care of things. And so the popes of Rome, of old Rome, I should say, Constantinople was called New Rome, but the popes of Rome became very, very powerful due to this in the Western Church. There's a power vacuum, and the popes of old Rome fill that and kind of get an oversized influence. And so you have the development of the papacy, or the pope, the bishop of Rome. And he develops this role as the ultimate and supreme head of the church. So for the Eastern Church, it's the Christian emperor, who's kind of like almost the supreme head of the church, who protects and guides the church. But there is no emperor in the West. So what's one of the oldest churches? Rome. What's one of the most powerful? Rome. So the Roman bishop becomes kind of like the head for the Western Church. see there where the word pope comes from. It comes from the Greek word papas, ultimately, which means father or daddy. And in the beginning, all bishops were called papas. They were all called popes. There's nothing unique about the term, but eventually it just gets reserved to the Bishop of Rome. So eventually this action by Constantine actually has the effect of causing disunity in Christianity, because the eastern and the western halves of the empire will start to grow apart. Okay? They still share pretty much the same beliefs, but they'll start to grow apart. Easterners will kind of resent the fact that the popes try to assert authority over the whole church, because, the emperor is with them, not with the popes, The Western church will start kind of seeing it as the true Christianity and stuff like that. Anyways, so it will actually create disunity. Constantine was finally baptized as a Christian on his deathbed, which was not unusual in those days. Usually most people waited until they were near death to be baptized, mainly because, after baptism you were not supposed to sin if you committed any major sin, and there was a whole process of penance that was long and people didn't want to do it, so they would just wait till they were near death. So you get your sins forgiven and you go straight to heaven. When you die, you get baptism. And Eastern Christians regard Constantine as a saint. So he's Saint Constantine the Great. In fact, he's even considered like one of the apostles. He's called the 13th apostle. Now, when did Christianity become the official religion? So we have 313, we have toleration, and within less than a century, we see how Christianity prospered with Constantine, because with his successor, already by 380, his successor, Theodosius I, the emperor, issues a document called Cunctos Populos, where he makes Christianity, and specifically Roman Christianity, interestingly enough, so the Pope, Roman Catholic, you might say, he makes that the official religion. That's the standard of the empire. So now there is an official religion. So within less than a century, if you're a pagan Roman, you must have thought the world was turned upside down. You're worshiping Zeus and Hermes and Mercury and all, Athena and all your gods at the temples. And all of a sudden, within less than a century, you have to worship this crucified Jewish man. It's the official religion of the emperor and the empire. So that's actually when Christianity becomes official, with Theodosius in 380, not with Constantine. Now we enter, actually I'll move on. Well, okay. The Christians call themselves Christians eventually. As I said, they were a movement, and then they start, their religion is the following of the Christ, and that's where we get Christianity from. That's what Christianity means, basically, the following of the one who is the Messiah, namely Jesus. So they call themselves Christians in general, but specifically when they say they're part of the church, they call themselves part of the Catholic Church. You don't want to think of it, just be careful that you don't think of it in modern terms as in the Roman Catholic Church. This included both the East and the West at this time. The word Catholic in Greek simply means universal. So the church was universal, included all peoples, all nations within it. Okay, so that's what it means, the universal church. And that's where we get this term, the Catholic Church. Now, eventually, it will become specifically tied to the Western variety of Christianity. And so we'll talk about the Roman Catholic Church, or just the Catholic Church in general, and people think of the Pope and stuff like that. But at this early period, it was meant to refer to all Christians as well. So they referred to themselves as Christians, or they referred to the church, or the Catholic Church, the universal church, which included all people. So it was an ancient name for this communion of Christian churches, Eastern and Western, and what they shared in their faith and the way they governed themselves and organized themselves. Okay, now we approach or get into the Middle Ages, which extends from the 5th century until the 16th century. And I'm going to skip over some of this just so I can move forward to more important events and how they affect Christianity. I guess just very quickly. To note, 476 AD is the usual date the historians give to the end of the Roman Empire, but actually it's the end of the Roman Empire. You have German tribes, Germanic tribes that were in these regions of northern Europe who eventually just invaded from the north down into the Western Roman Empire and decimated the Roman armies, defeated the Roman armies, and broke up the Western Roman Empire. Okay, so the political structure that was there was no longer there anymore. So there's chaos and stuff like that. This did not happen to the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire actually continued until the 1400s. I think it was 1453 that the Eastern Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, actually fell to Islamic armies. So it's only been like 500 years since the Roman Empire actually has not existed. It went on for a long period of time. But the Western Empire in the 5th century AD was done for because of the Germanic tribes. Again, there's a power vacuum here. So who steps in? Well, who's the most powerful bishop in the region? Who's the most powerful institution, or what's the most powerful institution? The only institution left standing after 476 and the destruction of the Western Empire is the church. Okay? It has institutions of learning. It has charitable works that it does. It has bishops who have to now take kind of like the role of rulers and political leaders, especially the Pope of Rome. So the church fills this vacuum for the next, many, many centuries, up until the 1500s, for almost the whole of the Middle Ages. And the Eastern Empire goes on its merry way until the 1400s, when it's destroyed by the Muslims. In the 600s AD, Christianity starts to encounter this new religion, which originates in the Arabian Peninsula, called Islam. Just like I talked about with, Hinduism and Judaism, okay? Islam branched out, it went east and west, and just like when it went out east, it encountered northern India and Hinduism. Certainly when it went north, it encountered Judaism and Palestine, and as it pushes west, it encounters the Western world and Christianity. And so Islamic armies, beginning in the 7th century, march across northern Africa. As you can see from this map, they even extend up into most of Spain and a part of France. Okay, and they subjugate these whole areas. A lot of them were Christian before. Northern Africa was all Christian before Islam. So they subjugate and destroy historically Christian areas in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. So that's a big influence, because once that starts, the Christians, especially in the West and the East, will kind of be fighting off the advances of Islamic armies, for like the next 500 years. And eventually the West, they usually are able to win, and eventually in the 1400s, for example, the Spanish are able to push the Muslim rulers out of Spain and also Portugal. But the Eastern Empire, eventually, they just keep incrementally, moving across Turkey into Greece, and eventually take Constantinople itself and end the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire is eventually taken over by the Islamic army. So it's a centuries-long battle with the advent of Islam. And so areas that had been historically Christian, like Northern Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, turned Muslim over the centuries. The next big event to discuss is what's called the Great Schism. The Great Schism. The word schism comes from a Greek word schizo, which means to cut. To cut. Schizo. To cut apart or cut. cut in two. And that's what a schism is. I guess I should have given you a definition for it. But the schism means just a breaking apart within a group. Okay? Something breaks apart. There's a schism. And there had been breakings apart of Christianity before this time in 1054 in the 11th century, but this is the major one. I mean, there had been little groups that went their own way. Oh, maybe little groups, or maybe not so little groups, that had kind of gone their own way over disagreements and beliefs before then. And I'll talk about some of them later in the course. But the main one is that, as I told you, when Constantine moves the capital east, it creates a power vacuum in the West, yes, but it creates disunity between East and West, and they start moving apart from each other. In their culture, I mean, their beliefs are still pretty much the same, but culturally and how they think about things start to differ greatly, more and more over the centuries. And so they become very different and estranged from each other until it reaches a breaking point in the 1000s, the 11th century. And there have been tensions before, but the tensions just come to a head. I mean, the East and West have been divided for quite some time, with two rulers, two capitals, two cultures, but it was just too much by the 11th century, and there was an official breaking apart. So what happens, in a nutshell, what happens to cause this breaking apart? Maybe I have to go back to my map. Do I give you a map here? No, I don't. That might be a better map. Okay, I'll use this map of Islam because it's clearer, I think. As you know, the empire was split in half. You had the eastern part and the western part. Okay, you had New Rome over here and Old Rome. And, there were... the problem was in the western part, the popes kind of filled that power vacuum, bless you, and were the most powerful figure in the West, and they kind of saw themselves as the custodians and the guardians of the church. And the eastern part of the church, New Rome, saw itself, they had the emperor, that's where the emperor was located, so he was kind of the head of the church, and so they thought they had the power. So there was a power play between the East and the West. Each one, the popes of Rome wanted to be in charge, but also the leaders of the Eastern Church wanted to be in charge because they had the emperor and the political power. And so there was fighting back and forth. And each group kind of messed around in the other's territory. For example, parts of southern Italy were part of, or were under the control of it sometimes, of the Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, to this day, you can go to Italy and parts of Italy, some of the towns in southern Italy, and the people are Greek-speaking. They don't speak Italian. They speak Greek. And this is a vestige, a holdover from the times when the Eastern Empire had control over parts of southern Italy, because their official language was Greek. It wasn't Latin or Italian. Anyways, and the popes claimed control over some parts of the Eastern Empire, parts like northern Greece and stuff like that. So there was political maneuvering going on. There was a power play going on where they were meddling in each other's territory, and so there was tension. The popes wanted to assert their control over the West against the East, and the East wanted to assert its control over its possessions in the East against the West. They wanted the Pope to stay where the Pope should stay, and on the Eastern side, the popes wanted the Easterners to stay where they should stay. They didn't want foreigners on their back doorstep, if you might say that. Say that. Okay, so what happens, how it comes to a head, is you have two players. You have a man named Pope Leo IX, who was Pope from 1049 to 1054. And you have a man called Michael I Cerularius, who was a patriarch. Now, anxiety. No. And maybe before I delve into this, because it does get a little bit intricate and detailed, I think I'll end here and come back to it on Thursday. So, God bless you all. Have a good day. Whoops. Have a good day, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.